Mark, you are muted. There we go.
Of course. Yeah, it's early, man. All right, so we got this figured out. I am now off mute, and welcome to Headless Creator. As always, I'm your host, Mark Demeny, and joined by Tim Benix, my colleague here at Uniform. And we're very pleased and fortunate to have Dean Barker come and talk about content modeling with us. And Dean is actually the author of a book, an actual dead tree thick version of a book on content modeling, and it is extremely comprehensive. We will basically be scratching the surface of what's in this book today. And Dean, why don't you introduce yourself and tell us why you love content modeling, why it's so important in the topic of content management.
Oh my goodness, awfully early in the morning for such an open-ended question. Buckle your seatbelts. Here we go. I'm the Global Director of Content Management at Optimizely. Optimizely is a company that was formerly Episerver, and it was a CMS company and really is now a digital experience company. We make a CMS, an experimentation platform, a CDP, a content marketing platform, the entire suite of content tools. I've been working with the CMS product for 16 years, I think. I've been working here for 4 years. Prior to that, I was a partner for 11 or 12. So I've long experience with our own CMS. And then I teach a CMS course at a university in Austria. So I teach content modeling and CMS there, which I enjoy very much. I love content modeling. It's one of my favorite aspects of content management because it's one of the few universals in the space. No matter what you do with content management, at some point, you're going to have to model your content. And basically what modeling means is you are going to take a general idea of content, which is the idea you have in your head of what you want to do with content, how you want to address content, display content, deliver content, and organize content. And you're going to turn that idea into something that a computer can manage. And to do that, you have to describe that content, sometimes in fairly excruciating detail, to a system that can understand it. And I'll give you an example of this. Let's say your company issues a lot of press releases. And you're like, well, we need a database to manage these press releases. Prior to this, you've just been writing press releases in Word and emailing Word documents to PR agencies. And you think, well, let's put these all in a database. Okay, well, that's a noble and great idea, but it's a leap from that to an actual system running in a computer somewhere that can manage that. First of all, you have to sit down and you have to ask yourself, what is a press release? Like, what constitutes a press release? So you may think to yourself, well, there's a title. There's always a title. There's always a subtitle. There's a date. And there's often a contact information at the bottom. And then there's a body of text. And that right there is the most rudimentary type of content modeling. You've taken this kind of large aggregate piece of content and you've broken it up into smaller objects that can be described to a computer and manage it. If you think about it like an Excel spreadsheet, right? If you're organizing something in an Excel spreadsheet, the first thing you have to do is create your column headings. I have a movie collection, like a DVD collection, and I'm going to organize that in Excel. I have to create column headings for like title and year and length and something like that. It's the only way you can really organize that. So that's the first step to content modeling. And then the next step is to examine each one of those pieces, like examine your title and ask yourself, what is required for a title? And I mean, the most basic thing is a title is required. You have to enter one. Okay, so that's what we would call a validation. So we're going to break it up into pieces. The first piece is going to be a title, and that's required. The date might be required. It also has to be a valid date. You can't just type like your favorite recipe in the date field. It actually has to be a date. Also, does it have to be a date in the past? Is there a range? Or could you earmark a press release to be released in the future? And then down in the contact information, is that just free form? Can you just write, Bob Jones down there and a random phone number? Or do you have to pick an employee from a list of acceptable employees? And that gets into what we call relational content modeling. Relational content modeling is how a piece of content relates to another piece of content. You're creating a link between pieces of content. And then the body of the press release, what is that? Is that just plain text? Or is that rich text? Can you include formatting in that text? What if you want to embed an image in this press release? Well, can you just embed any random image, or do you have to embed an image from a list of approved images, which also might be managed content? And so content modeling is the process of taking a very vague idea of what you want to do and turn it into a very specific thing that a computer or a content management system can manage. And it's really an art form, because you get into questions like granularity. Like, how granular do you model this content? I once calculated that a United States postal address could be broken down into, I want to say, between 13 and 15 different individual fields. Well, I mean, you could break it down into like the side of the street. You could break it down to a million different things. Well, who is going to use that level of granularity? Well, only one organization, probably the U.S. Postal Service. So you need to ask yourself, for your organization, do I need to break it down that far? Because there's always a balance between granularity and flexibility on the one side, and then complexity on the other side. And if you make your content model too complex, you drive your editors crazy, because they have to enter this very, very detailed information that they don't think is being used by anybody. And so it's an art form of finding a balance between simplicity and complexity, and describing it just enough that you can do what you need to do, but no more than that. And that's really the key. Okay, I've rambled on for 5 minutes there, so I'll pause.
Perfect. Yeah. So at that, that reminds me of a couple sort of ground rules for today's session, because I know we have lots of people who really know content modeling on social media have said, hey, we're going to attend this live stream. And so what I wanted to say was, first off, the point of this, we're trying to help people who are understanding content management systems, and really to sort of understand a few of the core capabilities, some of the philosophies, what some vendors do a little bit different. So we'll look at it a little bit from the vendor side. The second is, Dean, as we know, you love to monologue, and while ostensibly this is a 1 hour session, we're free to go over, so that we can do that and accommodate your predilection for monologuing, and mine as well, and Tim to a lesser extent.
I have a big cup of coffee, so as I get
We're ready to rock.
Yes, we're ready to rock. No, I appreciate that. I think that's an excellent intro, and I think it's something that both Tim and I we've both done for a number of years. I think one of the interesting things is Tim comes at content modeling very much from the developer side of things. I come from content modeling very much from the information architect's side of things. And, certainly as we're looking at vendors and how they implement content modeling, some of them lean towards a configuration-based approach, namely, hey, you can go through in the user interface, you can click and you can add fields and manage it from that perspective. Some go at it from a code-first approach, meaning that you have to define this content model in code. And some vendors allow both. And I think this is one of the things that is probably one of those things that, as an organization, you should understand those two differences up front, because there's a lot of kind of downstream decisions that flow from that philosophy of which one of these methods is more important and useful. I don't know, Dean, do you want to talk a little bit about that? And then Tim can as well, and I can add my perspective in those two approaches.
Yeah, this is a shift in the marketplace that shifted and then shifted back. It used to be that all modeling, I'm gonna change your nomenclature there from config to UI. It used to be that all modeling was really done from the UI. You would log into a system and you would point and click and create your content model. You'd create a new field and enter validation rules and things like that. And then I want to say about 10 years ago, we decided to start modeling content instead of from the UI using code. And what I mean by that is you would actually write, like, for instance, in C#, you would write a class file that would represent a content object. And the class, if you're not familiar with object-oriented programming, you'd write some code that would say this is a class or a content type, and it would have these different properties on it. And the reason why we shifted to that is, number one, it was much more precise. I mean, you can do more things in code than you can do from a UI. I'm going to say that as just a general statement. Code is designed to be very, very exacting. The other benefit of that is it fit kind of development pipelines a lot, because there were times where content model changes needed to go live the same time that other code changes, and this kind of bundled them all together. And one of the benefits of modeling from code is that you could treat your content models like code. You could check them into a version control system, you could diff them, you could roll them back, you could do all these different things. And what would normally happen with a CMS is when the CMS would start up, it would reflect this code and then kind of create the models to match it. But then we shifted again. That got to be very, very heavy, meaning it took a lot of developer work. If you wanted to change anything, a developer had to go in and make a change. And then the world moved towards more of a SaaS model. Kind of the headless revolution started, and we moved to more of a SaaS model. And so we really went back to UI-based modeling. And so it's kind of come full circle and gone back again. In general, these are generalities. Modeling from code is more precise, but it's heavier, requires more development input. Modeling from the UI is easier to do, but often you're constrained by what the vendor provides in their UI. The other thing is that modeling from a UI can be problematic in terms of moving content types between environments. If you develop a content type in your development environment, you need to move it to your production environment. Some vendors have solutions for that. I don't want to say that it's not a solution, but some vendors don't. And you have to like release code and then run over to your production environment really quick and make those same model changes. And that's fairly common as well. I think the right solution is a combination of both. I think the right solution is a UI that writes out configuration files. And that way you can model from the UI, but you could also model from the file system. Maintain files are kind of the currency of development, right? Files are the thing that we use to contain development artifacts. So I like the idea of taking a content modeling and being able to codify it to a set of files. But a UI is very handy. And what if you had a UI that just wrote these files out so you could write the files out from under the UI if you wanted to? I think that might be the right answer, but I don't have all the answers.
I think that's definitely the right answer. I haven't fully seen it yet. Me as a developer, I've gone through this whole code first thing, and then I would, as a lead, give all this code first focused content modeling to, let's say, a front end developer that needed to do a few things with these content models, but then put their front end brain into it, creating a nightmare of content models. Right? And so we've seen that multiple times. And so that actually, in the end, made us go back to do it in the UI. But then, like you said, it's really hard to then move that from a UAT stage to a staging stage or to a production one. And so I think a company like Prismic, who recently released something, they are very close to it now. What they decided is to remove all the modeling capabilities from their interface in the CMS itself on the SaaS. And then they made a developer tool that would, when you start it up, it shows you an interface. So you make the whole model in your interface. But while you're modeling, it saves it to files that are JSON with JSON schema that you can then upload and use or store somewhere and then sync back into the SaaS. And that's a pretty interesting one. However, it's still very developer focused, and sometimes it needs to be more of maybe an information architect person that's more of a product owner. And for them, it's really rough to load that on their laptops and do a local host development session to set that up. But I think there's interesting approaches here for sure.
I was going to say the same thing, and I'm going to say something, somewhat controversial. I think that content modeling is, for at least for larger organizations, more of an information architect task than it is a developer task. If you think back to what Dean was talking about at the start of this conversation, and all of the rules for each of those elements of content, is it a reference lookup? Is it required? Does it have validation on it? Am I going to have to make some custom UX around these things? Like, all of these things are really more like a business analyst, information architect type task. And it has been a developer task because the tools have made it a developer task, but I don't think really philosophically it sort of sits that way. But ultimately, I do absolutely agree with Dean and Tim. Again, especially at an enterprise level, that capacity to do both. So yes, business users can start to do that modeling, but then you absolutely need to have a code-based way of capturing that model, source controlling it, doing those code release changes. So, the CI/CD functions. And I think, again, this is why we're having this discussion up front. It sounds pretty academic, but if you've picked a headless CMS that only allows you to do configuration based modeling, and they don't have a way of getting those models out through an API and into files and into source control and into your change control process, you're going to have some problems. If you're doing anything that's remotely complex, or you're pushing out major changes of content and design at the same time. And so I think this is a pretty fundamental choice and understanding that you have to have early on in the process.
Well, the other thing is that content model changes don't happen in a vacuum. They tend to involve a cascade of changes. Because a lot of systems say, if you want to add a new field to your content model, you just go here in the UI and add a new field. Okay, well, great. But for what purpose? You don't add a new field just to add a new field. I mean, you're going to do something with that data. Sometimes, I suppose, you might add an administrative only field for your own organization. But usually you add that field because you want to output that field. Well, can you do that? Just adding the field is often not enough. I mean, if you add a field that you want to output, you need to have access to the templating, and maybe you do. Maybe you have a builder system that will let you output that. But many times, by modeling from the UI, you're able to do half of what you want to do, but you still have to bring in a developer to do the other half. And then the developer may look at what you've done from the UI and say, well, that's all wrong. That's not what I need.
Yeah,
so definitely. They have to go back in and change that anyway. So the larger point is, I don't know that there's any one right answer to this. I hate to say it depends, but this is a very vague conceptual kind of world. And anybody who tries to say this is the one absolute right answer that will work in all cases, I will automatically guarantee that answer is wrong.
Yeah, I think it depends is the thing that we say most on this live stream.
Oh my goodness.
I'm afraid.
We should call the live stream It Depends, because really that's what...
we had that plan, but we decided not to go for that.
I know somebody has a podcast they called Per My Last Email, which I thought was hilarious. Yeah. We should call this live stream It Depends.
We thought about it, and then we got a cease and desist from a large adult diaper manufacturer. So we had to stop doing that. I think it's on that subject. I think at the end, time permitting, there's a few examples that we'll talk about some differentiating capability, because I think, Tim, you're mentioning the Prismic slice machine. We're also seeing some differences in like Storyblock and the blocks that they model, Sanity and how they model. So there's a lot of variations to this. And so I think it's interesting because it's these vendors trying to address what Dean is talking about, right? Like, there's no right way, but we think this way might have some of these advantages for these different uses.
Dean, if you permit me, I have a question on this to see what from your perspective, because let's say you have a lot more experience here than I, and I'm just coming at this from a developer side of things. So let's try this. So if you look at CMSs or systems like where you work at Optimizely, or maybe the Adobes, they kind of have a front end that is hybridly coupled to that content model somehow. And you can actually make pages with components and move them around and say, hey, this is now a page design model versus this is my domain data that is specifically there modeled, and I can use that in any channel, right? So if you now go and look at a fully headless CMS, as headless as it gets, like Sanity, there's almost not even a studio in there to change things. What is your opinion about where data needs to live? Does your design data of this is how the page looks, should that live in the same system as this is my data model that is for any channel that can work in 10 years? Like, how should that combine?
Fun question. So this goes back to what I said before, is that, there's a balance between simplicity and complexity and kind of purity. If I was going to build an absolutely pure system, like an absolutely pure system that was like textbook, architected perfectly, this is probably what I would do. And give me some latitude, because I'm going to qualify this in just a second. I would say that the core content repository should be just the core essence of the thing, right? For the press release, it should be the title, the subtitle, the date, and really that's it. Presentation level data should be a projection of that content object. And what I mean by this is there's a difference between the content and the artifact, right? The content are just the core properties. The artifact is the web page. So what you should do in that case is you should create a press release content object and then a press release page content object, which is an extension of the press release object. And the specific data in it, like it would have like the meta tag data, and it would have, I don't know, font size, font face, things like that, things specific to that particular level of presentation. Now that I think a lot of people can argue is like objectively the right way to do it, because the press release is a thing and the web page is also a thing. Now the web page is based on the press release thing, but this goes back to what I said before. That is an objectively pure and perfect way to do it. Is that the most useful way to do it? In many cases, no, because in many cases, what your authors are doing is they're actually building a web page. And additionally, even if you want to use that press release in other places, the additional properties required to create the press release page are so incidental and small that it just makes sense to make it part of the core model. Mm-hmm. And this goes back to the phrase, it depends. It depends what you're doing. Yes. In this, I've explained to you how I would do it in a pure, theoretically perfect way. And I've explained how I would do it in the real world. And those two are not the same thing.
Yeah, I think this, you know, if you take a step back, this goes right back down to the value of structured content versus page-based approaches to things. Right. You know, in a lot of cases, you know, if you're just making a simple website or a blog, a page-based approach is fine. WordPress is fine. You know, I think even within the headless community, there's all these discussions about like, oh, you know, headless will replace WordPress. I'm like, nah, it probably won't, because WordPress is really, really good at that task of making, you know, pages. Usually those pages are blog posts or, you know, something of a news type release, and it has a lot of features and functions and a lot of UX around that use case, and it's very good at that task, and it's a very specialized function. So again, yes, it depends, and that's an example of that. It depends in action, and why it's such a, you know, well used and popular platform.
Yeah, and I do want to, you used the magic phrase there, page-based CMS. I do want to talk about that for just a second, because the concept of page-based CMS has become like pejorative, right? You say, you never say page-based CMS in a complimentary way. You always say,
I just did.
You always say people like crap on a CMS. Oh, that's a page-based CMS. Here's something I've thought about doing. I'm going to say a domain name that somebody can go register if they want, but I want to create a website called soyouwannabuildacms.com. And on this webpage, I'm literally going to do like a tutorial of, if you want to build a CMS, these are all the things you have to do. Not because I want to teach somebody how to build a CMS, but I just want to explain to somebody all the things you have to think about building CMS. Mm-hmm. So let's build a hypothetical CMS for just a second. Let's build a CMS to manage our press releases. So we're going to create a database table. We're going to have title, subtitle, date, body, contact information, all that stuff. How do we turn that into a page-based CMS? You know how you do it? You add one field to that table called URL. And that's really all you do it. I maintain that a page-based CMS is a regular CMS that just has a URL field that you can look up in response to an inbound request. And honestly, Optimizely CMS, that's sort of what it is. We have in our CMS, the way it's architected, we have a core content object called a block. And then we have a page, and a page is just a block with a URL. So I hate it when people use the word page-based CMS because it sounds like super, super pejorative. But if you add a URL to another content object, you sort of have a web CMS. I'm not saying that's all there is to it. There's more to it than that. But anyway, I just page-based CMS. I was just
Well, and it is funny you mentioned that. Like Contentful has done exactly the same thing, right? They have Contentful Compose, and then it introduces this concept of a page, and that's exactly it. It's like, oh, okay, well, it's got a URL wrapper and a few fields for SEO, and now you're managing pages. I think, you know, you're right. There is a lot more to it than that, and at the risk of kind of pulling us back to the core subject of content modeling, I'm going to say, maybe we'll leave it at that for another meeting. And I'm
just going to say that Contentful, in particular, have some experience with Contentful. I've built several websites with Contentful over the years. They have a field called slug, And
Yeah.
slug
Yes,
is a
exactly.
unique text-based field. It's a unique text-based field that matched to a piece of content. Gosh, that sounds a lot like a URL to me. And so the first thing you do if you want to create a website out of Contentful is you take an inbound request and you find the content that matches the slug. So anyway.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, so let's go back to some of the core capabilities. And so, Dean, again, you mentioned it earlier at the beginning. Some of this is field definition, some of it's the ability to do references to other content items. Let's talk about that in a little bit more detail. And maybe this time, for the sake of balance, I'll give Tim first crack at it.
Oh, how about that? Let's
You
see.
can wave your hand if you want us to jump in and take over, but
You know what? I might, outside of going into all these core capabilities, I think Dean is a better person, and you are also to talk about those. But what I do want to talk about is how deep you can go with all these capabilities and connecting things up. And so it's interesting to see how far you can go. Like in my past, when I started, I was quite a youngster, not knowing too much about any of this. And then so I started to work at a company called Mediamatic, which was, I don't know, 2007, 6. And it was all PHP, and it was all kind of this. Every item we built was just a line in a database, very simple. And then it was a bit of the WordPress approach, basically. And so we then decided to make a change to make something called a triple store. That's what they call it. I didn't know what that meant exactly.
RDF.
And it was really interesting. And since I learned just that thing, my brain exploded and I started loving content modeling, because what we decided to do is everything in a system is a thing. And so let's talk about this press release, right? You have a press release itself, but then you also have an author. And then the author is also a thing in this database. And then you have an edge connection that says this is the author, because this person can also be a person and a family member to another person that is then an edge link that is family member. And on that edge link, we were also sometimes even able to add some data like a date or something like that. And once I started to understand then something like clicks, and then you realize, oh, Facebook uses that model as well. These are your friends, and then those are the connections. And it's so interesting to see how these things now can grow and how they are shown in systems like a Contentful or an Optimizely, and how people would try to understand to connect the things up. And so, yeah, what I've seen, if developers are in charge of setting these things up, then it gets quite abstract very fast. And so I've seen it where we had to have like a simple tabs field. So 4 tabs, and each content item in the tab would then be connected to another item elsewhere. And we loved it, this whole graph, it was perfect. And then a content editor started to add the tabs on the page CMS, there you go. And it literally took them, I think, 45 minutes of clicking and creating and figuring it out. And then they would not have understood that graph at all.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And so all these lovely ideas are, you have to be somehow pragmatic without making it too complicated. So I just wanted to give that little history there of why I'm so excited about it, but also where we have to find the line, because when you go over it, you burn very fast. And that's kind of where my knowledge really stops. I understand that basic graph idea where you can do one to many or many to many or that kind of stuff. But for our audience, do we need to go into all the principles, or do we just give opinions like I just did? What is the best way?
What you're talking about there, Tim, was RDF, Resource Description Framework.
Okay, I did not know that term.
Yes.
So please explain.
RDF, a triple is source relationship target, right? So if I write an article is an object, and that has a source, and I am the target, and the relationship is author, and that's called a triple. And Resource Description Framework, there's a great O'Reilly book called Programming the Semantic Web. Absolutely blew my mind in the way things that can be modeled. But what you're talking about there, Tim, is the most pure, beautiful way to manage content, a graph of content, but also like incredibly hard to deal with.
Oh, and yes. And it was slow. Yeah. It was so slow.
As vendors, we often need to put a happy face on that. We need to
Yes.
look at our editors and say, what are they capable of? What are the constraints they're working under? And how can we put a pretty easy, friendly face on something as abstract and wildly powerful as resource description framework? So yeah, RDF, Programming the Semantic Web, read that book. It's fantastic.
Yeah, because at that time we had one system that could do that, and we would power different websites. And at one point we managed to put in an extension to the Jewish History Museum in the Netherlands. And there's lots of Jews who passed away during World War II in the Netherlands. And we had their whole family tree and what they did and in which documents they were found. And that was that whole that approach to storage was extremely abstract, but we tried to make it simple for content editors where they would have a document and they could literally just highlight a name in it and then say, this is an actor in this thing and this is that person. And then we made a social media platform that could do that, because the original database we weren't allowed to touch, because that's the Jewish history monument. And it was so interesting to put something so abstract into the hands of users that actually were able to understand it. But you had to be a bit of a geek to go into it, though.
Well, and that's what you're saying. You're looking at that and you're loving that from the perspective of a developer. And
100%.
so one of the things about content modeling is, do you look at it as a developer or do you look at it as an editor? And there are many times as a developer where you want to do something which is hypothetically pure and perfect from an engineering standpoint.
Yeah.
And you need to ask yourself, I mean, our editor's going to understand that? And the answer to that might be no. So if they're not going to understand that, either you corrupt your model to benefit the greater good so that your editors can work with it easier, or you find a way to put a UI on that makes it comprehensible for editors, but keeps you happy. And that's the perfect case, that if you can wrap it in a UI that editors understand and makes you happy from a data standpoint. But sometimes you can't. And sometimes as a developer, you need to take one for the team and say, look, this is going to be less perfect because it makes the lives of my editors better, because the most perfect content model in the world that editors don't understand and don't want to use is used.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and I will kind of want to pull that back to an example and go back to the press release example that you were talking about, Dean. And you're saying, hey, a press release has an author, and there's kind of 2.5, 3 ways of doing that. The first is, okay, that author field is a reference, and it's going to point to your list of author content items, and you're going to pick one of those people from the list of author content items. Now, that then raises something. Oh, okay, you're now writing a press release and you're attributing it to some author that doesn't exist yet. You're putting a burden onto that editor to say, right, I'm creating this. Now I need to go off and create another item in that author's bucket of content, and then do that first, and then come back to my press release.
Yeah, this is where it gets rough for editors.
Yeah.
Right. But they just want to stay in the same page.
Yeah, exactly. So
this gets, when we talk about validation, right? Validation is great. We want to validate our content model to keep it safe. But where do you do the validation? Many systems validate content before you're allowed to leave the editorial UI, before you're allowed to save the content object, right? So you can't save it without picking an author. And they think, well, that's just the right way to do it. Well, what if the author doesn't exist? Or what if, I don't know, you don't know who the author is yet? You're maybe going to pick a different author. So delayed validation, I talk about that in the book. That's a very, very handy thing, that maybe you let people have unfinished, broken content objects, but you just don't let them publish it. So you let them save them, but then you don't let that publish or go live or be incorporated to the public domain of content until it's set. That lets them have draft objects, essentially. So they could create this thing, and maybe they don't have a publication date yet. Maybe they don't have the author yet, and they can go back and finish it later. So delayed validation, great feature that can enhance usability of a system by a shockingly large amount. And it's a simple change like that where you're taking editors into account.
Yeah.
Oh, I love that. I never thought of it, because my first idea is defensive coding. Which you will mostly do right, but once it goes wrong your production side is crashed.
Defend at the line of publication, not necessarily the line of creation.
I love that.
So I think that's a great example. I think another good example is, again, something you touched on earlier, which is how much work can you customize in that authoring interface? Because if you look at systems that were designed for large amounts of publication, there's different ways of handling that author thing. It may default to the current user that's creating that content. If you're an organization like a news organization, let's say you're Vox or the Washington Post, you might be creating content in the CMS. Therefore, the author 90% of the time might be you, and so we can fill in that as a default. Or it could be something where you're typing in values and it will do a search in the background and then find the connection to some existing author to link up, and you can do that. Or if it doesn't exist, it will automatically create that for you. So I think I'm not, there's no one right approach. Again, it depends. But I think the key is to understand when you're looking at vendors, if you do need to do that type of thing to make your editors' lives easier, how easy is it to do that? And I think that's one of the core capabilities that I think is worth understanding is, what are these fields that are out of the box? How do they behave? How much control do you have over some of the interface elements there? And if it ends at a certain point, how easy can you do that customization?
Yeah, when you look at the customization of a content model in a package vendor solution, there's kind of two different levels. Can you create a custom field that is customized from the storage level? For example, maybe you want a field that when it is saved, it actually inserts things in a different database table. Do you actually want to customize how this data is stored? Often, no, you wouldn't want to do that, but you might want to control how the data is serialized. An example for that is, let's say you're storing a color. You're letting them pick a color. Well, you want to store the color in RGB values. So you're going to have 3 integers from between 0 and 255. So normally you would control the serialization of that. You would roll that up into like a JSON object and store that as text. So that's one level of customization. Are we actually customize how it's stored in the back end and how it's serialized and unserialized? The other thing of customization is, do you just want to customize the UI that the editors are working with? And that's very, very common. For instance, if we're going to store an author, and an author in our system is an ID value for another content object somewhere in the system. Well, the system in many cases doesn't care how we find that ID value. We can type that in by hand if we feel like it. But you want to provide a very customized situation for your editors. So you just need to create a UI component that customizes that. And I want to give some props to Contentful because they did a really nice job here. Contentful made a really great extension system where you could just extend from like the HTML, JavaScript, CSS level. And they did a very, very nice. I wrote several Contentful extensions, one of which I'm told formed the basis of one of their standard kind of UI components later on. So they did a really nice job with that. And every system, every vendor has a system like, I don't want to say every vendor, most competent vendors have a system that you can extend the UI.
Yes, I think that's an important.
That's a very good
Yes,
one.
Yes,
yes.
so I'm going to say most.
What is it? Douglas Adams would say, "It's only the ones that we care about." That
right.
Yeah.
They have a system. The question is how kind of onerous and how like heavy is that system? Contentful, I think, broke some new ground in making that incredibly light and just letting you customize from the front end, like if you do some HTML and some JavaScript. Because Contentful's theory was, we're a headless CMS. We only care about the data anyway, so we don't give a crap how you get this data. I mean, I don't know. Use a magic 8-ball to get the data if you want. Just send us the data that you get. And I think Contentful did a nice job there.
Yeah, I think a lot of CMSs followed suit in that vein.
They did.
Yeah.
A lot of them did what they call light. Magnolia has what they call a light development model, which is interesting. Magnolia is a Java-based system, but they have an entire second level of development, which is YAML-based. You actually create a YAML file to configure like a UI and things like that. And it's nicely done. And I'm absolutely, this is beyond the scope of content modeling, but I'm absolutely fascinated by the fact that most CMSs are built in layers. Like at the bottom of the layer, you have the core vendor code. Then you have your integration code that works in the same computational space. Then you have your UI code, and then you have your publication code. And the question is, how far do you let users, customers, go down that stack? And I think that we're seeing some really remarkable changes there in the space. But again, we're beyond content modeling now.
Yes and no. I mean, I think there is a very close relationship between content modeling and how people are actually working on top of that content model?
Content model is the first thing that you need to
Yeah.
customize in a CMS. I'm going to say the first thing you got to customize is the content model. And so the customization model, the customization framework or paradigm of your system, a content model is the first thing that affects. And so thank you, Mark, for bringing that back to content modeling. But how you customize a content model will play out through the entire CMS installation.
Yeah, absolutely. I think on that note, let's see. I'm looking at our agenda and what we've covered, and we've covered a lot of stuff. We've covered references. I think references are extremely important. Oh, well, depending upon the organization. Again, right, if you're just doing a lot of blogs, maybe references aren't so important because you're just going to be referencing to things like authors and whatnot. If you're building a product catalog, or if you're doing Tim's example of genealogy and historical records, and something will approach basically graph level complexity. I know it's a bit of a tangent and it's an advanced topic, but I think we have been hinting around it. Let's talk a little bit about graph capability.
Yeah. So graph, in a general term, a graph is an interrelated set of nodes, right? Network theory. So you have nodes and you have edges that are connected, and that's a graph. So GraphQL is essentially a query language that understands the concept of the graph, and you can traverse the graph. And so the idea behind, let's back up for a second. Headless interfaces, base headless interfaces, the kind of REST interfaces that we were working with for many years, they have a tendency to both overfetch and underfetch, meaning the data you get back from them is like very, very crude because all they can do is kind of give you back the raw data by type. An example for that is if I want a list of press releases, I can go to my REST interface. Okay, give me a list of press releases. But when those press releases come back, they're all just going to have the author's ID in them. Well, crap, I need the author now. So for each one of those press releases, so it's underfetched essentially. And I want to get the author's name so I can list the name out too. So I have to go back for each one of those press releases and say, okay, give me author ID 652 or whatever. But I just want the first and last name of that author. Well, the system's like, well, sorry, I got to give you the whole thing. So now it's overfetching. So essentially, most remote headless APIs kind of underfetched and overfetched the models, and GraphQL is an attempt to change that. What GraphQL lets you to do is it lets you traverse the graph. So you can say, give me a list of press releases or a query, press releases that satisfy these specific criteria. And then for each one of those, traverse the graph over to the author model and pull some data off that. And then you can get it back in a format that looks like it was stored that way. Essentially, you can fake the form, this is the truth. GraphQL lets you create a phantom content model. It lets you create a content model that you want back and then go back and say, populate this from the actual content model. So what gets really fascinating about GraphQL is you have content models that work in two different layers. You have the actual core content model, and then you have the content model that's returned from a query. And you may have designed that query because you wanted that content back, or your developer may have designed that query. And so you're getting back what looks like a content model, but you don't understand it's actually just a projection of the content model in the graph.
Yeah, I'm actually going to take take
well.
2 seconds to do a little bit of a uniform plug, because that's a little bit of what we're trying to do, which is that exact level of functionality from GraphQL, which is, hey, you can make your own experience model and populate it from a bunch of these other underlying content sources. I think the difference for us is GraphQL is a very developer focused tool and Uniform is more end user focused. But conceptually, I think it's a very powerful concept, and I think it is more advanced. But once you get to a certain level of what you're trying to do with content, and it may be different channels or it may be different use cases, that level of abstraction is really important and useful.
So I am reading a book right now that was written in 1960 something. I don't know. It's called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. It's a very, very famous book by a guy named Thomas Kuhn, Kuhn. And what he did, he's kind of a philosopher and a scientific historian, and he talks about how science progresses. And he talks about science does not progress steadily, step by step. What happens is it goes step by step by step until it butts up against the limits of what he calls a paradigm. And then there's a massive revolution and they throw away the old way of doing things and they get a new paradigm, and then it goes step by step from that. And I keep asking myself, when it comes to content management, like, what are the revolutionary paradigms that we tossed away? I think you can make an argument that maybe Headless CMS was a paradigm shift, right? That was a revolution in the CMS. But I'm wondering, what is the next revolution in CMS? And I'm beginning to think it might be graph projection. I don't want to say GraphQL, it's a specific graph projection.
Yeah.
It may be the idea that the content model we present to people does not in any way represent the actual content model. And Tim, I'm going to go back to your conversation you had previously about triples and RDF. Triples and RDF is a beautiful, pure, lovely, incredibly unusable way to store content.
Clearly,
what if we could have a content store that used triples to store and relate content, but then we had a graph projection that made it look like it's just a simple Excel spreadsheet with columns, right? Is that a revolution? Could we get to a point where 10 years from now, that's the only way we're doing content modeling, and we wondered how the hell we ever did it before? So I keep wondering, what is the next revolution in the CMS space? And
I think this graph projection is definitely one. I think technology is holding us back a little bit right now, because if you implementing a GraphQL interface on your product is extremely complicated because it's a dynamic model.
It is.
So you have to understand your own graph extremely well. And your underlying, like if every time you see a CMS that started with REST and then had to implement a GraphQL interface has oddities inside how you can query that data. And I've never had a really easy way until I reached, I think it was Casey CMS, that's relatively new. And they're in Berlin.
What's it called?
Casey CMS. It's yet another CMS. There's so many. It's crazy. And then you have Graph CMS that's now called HighGraph. And then even those two that were native GraphQL have different implementations, different naming. It's so complicated if you have to learn it on the developer end, because GraphQL language is very, very opinionated with the namings it uses. And so for me, just trying to do the simplest thing, a paginated list, I can now not explain to you how to do that in GraphQL because I have to read up on it again. And so,
and the implementation
technology is just, it's close, but it's and also you can only do post requests to make it super dynamic. And if you wanted to do a GET request that's cacheable and fast, it needs to be the same model that returns every time. And so it's close, but it's not there.
Whenever I talk about like content modeling and revolutions in content modeling, I go back to the fact that if you could express all your content in a simple Excel spreadsheet with rows and columns, okay, that's the most default content model, is an Excel spreadsheet. If you want to go beyond that, ask yourself, are you actually going to be any better off? Because there are many times where I've worked with extremely advanced, complex modeling and content management features and said to myself, damn it, I wish I had an Excel spreadsheet of this.
Well, and that's what Airtable is.
Right.
You know, I think the only difference is it doesn't necessarily have the capabilities on the API side for delivery that you might expect from a CMS. But
so Airtable absolutely has a REST API. It's quite competent. I've used it quite a bit. I don't know that they have a GraphQL API.
I don't know.
But if they ever do have a GraphQL API, then now we're going to be making graph projections, graph representations of content that's stored in like a flat Excel spreadsheet in Airtable. And I go back to, is that the next revolution? A generic storage method and everything is just a graph projection.
Yeah, they have GraphQL. I just found it. Okay,
there you go. So sorry, Mark, they're not as simple as you think they are.
Let's see here. Yeah, fair enough. This is one of the pitfalls of opining in this industry is there's a 30% chance that you're wrong about something just because things change so quickly.
The only opinion in this industry is a wrong opinion.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, and it travels fast when you have an opinion.
That's true. Let's see here. Okay, so I'm going through advanced capabilities. We've talked about reference.
Oh, I do want to talk about referential stuff because this is the point that a lot of people don't consider. There are two types of ways to do references. And one is a true reference where you're referencing another content object. But often what is more helpful is what I would call an embedded reference. And what that is when you essentially create another content object, but it's actually not a separate content object. It lives inside a parent content object.
Yeah.
And that can be very helpful because sometimes you just want to model something to a certain level of granularity, but you don't want that content object to be available to anything else. It is wholly owned by its parent object. And additionally, you want that object to live within the life cycle of its parent. If the parent gets deleted, you want that to deleted. You want it to mirror the parent's permissions. If somebody can read the parent, somebody can read the child. And so that's a very, very subtle thing. Is it really a reference or is it an embed? And many times an embedded thing is much, much more usable.
Yeah, actually, that's worth talking about because we were going to talk a little bit about differentiating capabilities later on. That's essentially what Storyblock and blocks are, right? You've created this little content item, but it's tied to that parent content item. It can't be referenced outside the context of that.
Yeah, this is the basic of Prismic slices, and
Yeah.
they decided to go for that to make it easier for the editors. So you can make any content type that you want with all the fields and all the references that you want, but each content type on its own then has these slices that you can use to show something. But if you wanted in that content type to connect to two media items, let's say two images, they don't let you do that. Then you need to make a slice that can show an image, or you add multiple slices that show images. And so they're it's very strange because you cannot actually query slices from other content items.
Yeah. So
So
I was
you
going to
duplicate
say,
yourself all the time.
yeah, let's balance out. Yes, this is powerful and flexible, but what's the compromise to that, right?
Well, scale, essentially.
So Storyblock, Prismic, both great systems. Impressed with them both.
They are, yes.
I feel like they've just put a name on something that's fairly obvious that at the risk of arrogance here, Optimize's been doing for years. And I'll give you an example of how we used to do referential things, but we gave it the option to do embedded things. And here's an example is, in our page model, if you were to create a page, you can create blocks that then go on that page. Traditionally, those blocks were always standalone content objects, which means if I created a block to go on a page, even if I only wanted that block used on that page and nowhere else, and I was literally creating that block just for like structure and visual presentation, that block was always its own content object, which is complicated in many ways. I mean, it can have its own life cycle. It can have its own permissions. Like you could publish the page, but the change to the block wasn't published. And it was a pain. Now, it was very elegant. You could reuse blocks in all sorts of pages, but many times an editor just wanted the block on that one page. So we actually introduced this concept of local blocks, which means the blocks became embedded objects. So if you created a local block just for a page, then that wasn't shareable to other pages because you didn't want that. It just lived within the confines of that page. So essentially, we took a referential object and we created it as an embedded object, which ended up being much more useful for the editors. You can still do referential objects, but what we found is that 95% of blocks are really local embeds. Yeah. And so while making that a separate referential object is the pure textbook way to do it, it's often not the usable way to do it. And what you end up with is customers with thousands of blocks, which are no longer being used by a page, but just kind of live on as zombie blocks because they weren't connected to the page that then got deleted out from underneath them.
Yeah, and the difference is that the likes of Prismic and Storyblock, that's their key feature. And then later on, they add other things, like where I asked the Storyblock guys, hey, can I just not make blog posts that I reference somehow? So, oh yeah, you have to make a global object, and we'll ask our developers. It's like, dude, that's, whoa, really?
Yeah.
So their key feature is the other side, the embedded blocks, and they do that extremely well. But to me, you need some sort of a balance, I guess.
Yeah, that's interesting. It would seem to go the other way, make referential blocks and then provide a way to embed them, because you could embed them by just, having some cascading delete or something like that. So interesting that that's the way they do it. Two great systems, got nothing bad to say about them, but it seems like they should have gone.
They are the most growing CMSs in the space, I think. I think Prismic has 20,000 customers. It's ridiculous.
Yeah, they're based out of Paris, right?
They're in Paris. Yeah, I know them very well.
Yeah. And I've been impressed with Prismic, talked to them in the past, been impressed with Storyblock.
Yeah, and Storyblock had a huge investment, and they're doing really well.
So let's see, we've talked about Prismic, Storyblock. I think another vendor that's interesting to discuss, again, in terms of how they manage the creation of content models in a headless SaaS context is Sanity. I think Sanity kind of, you get some interesting opinions because a lot of people say like, oh, it's very, very developer leaning, which is true. You've got to model out the content, your content item in JavaScript. The interesting thing about that is, okay, it's JavaScript. You can embed a bunch of functions in that content item. And so it's very easy then to extend that model for authors, and that customization that we were talking about, that's really, really critical to get right. Sanity kind of brings that a little bit closer to the content model. And I think if done well, it may enable some of that author usability earlier in the process, unlike having to, kind of added a couple layers higher in the stack. So I like Sanity for that as well. I don't know, Dean and Tim, what you think about that model too.
Well, I mean, Sanity, everything you described as Sanity does in JavaScript. Right? Optimizely is done C#.
Yeah, it's fully Node.js.
Yeah, I mean, one of the benefits of code-first modeling is that you're not just describing properties. Sometimes you can write methods and functions, and you can write abstraction layers. If I'm writing a C# class, I have the entire scope of the C# language to make this content object both store data and function the way I want it to, which is extremely powerful. But let's talk regression to the mean for just a second, because when we talk about something like Optimizely code first and Sanity code first, eventually the market forces you to wrap that stuff in a UI. And this is like regression to the mean, right? Every outlier eventually regresses to the mean of what the industry and customers.
Well, that's why you have the Sanity Studio, right?
Yeah,
they have to do it.
Right. Yeah. You eventually regress to what the customers want. The trick is, I mean, the key is, can you give the customers in the market what they want while maintaining the option of developer purity and power?
I think Sanity found a really good balance there, because they are very pure in their content modeling, and it's all developer driven. They literally say we are by developers for developers, but then they have this studio thing that you can host yourself and customize the hell out of it and do anything you'd want for your content editors. It's a lot more work. Like starting up a project, I've done a few bigger ones with them where you had user accounts and people could make their own content in the studio without touching all the data models and all that stuff. And the startup was quite extensive, but once it was running, it was so customized. I had not seen a system like that before.
So that by developers for developers is great in theory, especially for a startup. What's eventually happens is that you run out of customers that are entirely interested in that paradigm. And you start edging into other. We saw this with a lot of the really early headless vendors. So they were very much developer plays, but then they ran out of massive enterprise companies to sell to that wanted that. So they had to start creating kind of editor tooling. And I think Sanity will go that same way. The trick is,
actually.
Can they create that kind of editor mass market tooling while still maintaining developer purity? And this is the trick for any software in any space. Is can your software address multiple audiences and keep them all happy? And the developer, the architect that can make your software do that is a magical unicorn of a thing. So
or just choose, like Prismic chooses mid-market and then does it extremely well.
Right. So and Sanity might just choose developers. Sanity may think we're going to be by developers for developers. If they do, they'll necessarily,
for example,
they'll necessarily limit their market. Maybe that's where they go. They're very, very smart people over there. I know a few people over there. I like them very much. I'm interested to see how they approach it.
So let's see. I think what you just said, Dean, there about kind of the regression to the mean and having to sort of do these different approaches, and really the differentiating thing that you're looking at when you're evaluating those CMSs is like how well done is that? How clean is that? Did they manage to succeed in balancing those interests? I think that's a really good point. We are coming up on time. Are there any other closing thoughts that you want to conclude on, so that if people are watching this and they're going off and forget, everything we just talked about in the previous hour, what are the 3 things that they should walk away from and think when they're thinking content modeling when they're looking at evaluating CMSs?
Your content model is utterly foundational. There's no other aspect of a CMS implementation that will reverberate through the entire experience like a content model. I mean, it's like the foundation of a house. You screw up the foundation of a house, you have a real problem making a decent house on top of it. But if you have a solid foundation, you can fix problems in the house later on. Unfortunately, building the world's perfect content model is always contextual. It's never absolute. It depends on what people are going to do with your content later on. So great systems make content models easy to change in the future. I think we saw this with like Contentful. Contentful has a migrations system where if you want to change your content model later on, there are API hooks to kind of migrate from one model to another. Episerver, Optimizely CMS, my company, has had a way to change content types in the future. So the flexibility to change your content model and adapt it later on is very, very important. And so
I think that's also undervalued. I think a lot of people don't think of, they think, oh, they'll do their content model, and let's accept the reality. Your content models will change. Part of that is just learning as you're going. Part of it is, you may have made tiny little mistakes early on. Part of it is your actual use cases may change, but that happens a lot, I think. And I think that may be one of the reasons why people even consider replatforming. I look at a lot of people saying, hey, I want to look at a new CMS. Like, well, why do you want to do that? Oh, I hate our existing CMS. Well, why do you hate it? And a lot of times it'll come down to the implementation, and content modeling is a big part of that. And if you can adapt that easily, you may be able to move forward with the existing CMS. In a lot of cases, people can't because they haven't considered that up front. So that's my 2 cents on that.
No content model is right. It's just right now.
Yeah.
Yeah, and of course the drawback is if a CMS starts to charge you based on how many content models you have and how many connections you make, actually, like you could essentially take the same CMS and make another greenfield project inside it, but you're going to pay twice as much because you add new things or move them or.
I don't want to call out specific vendors, so I won't mention any names, but
I also purposely didn't do that. But.
I don't love vendors that are charging you money. I don't love the idea of making modeling decisions based on budget. So I'm a huge fan of that.
I have been on calls where basically a client says a lot of their mental energy is constantly refactoring their models to stay below a certain limit where they're sort of mid-market, and then beyond that they're enterprise and their costs triple. And they basically said like, hey, if I add a couple models, all of a sudden my costs go through the roof. And so they're refactoring models all the time. Like,
and that's tragic because content models, a domain of content models is very incremental. I mean, you'll add one, you'll add two. And the idea that at some point you're going to cross a tier that is so financially onerous that you're going to avoid crossing that tier, that's just not great. I don't love that.
Yeah. I think that's one of these things we should have mentioned early on is this is we do have a separate video for pricing, and I think we will pick at that a lot.
Yeah, that's an interesting one for sure.
Yeah, I'm glad we covered that in the content modeling session.
I only know firsthand of one system that charges based on the number of models. But as we move more into like headless SaaS being normalized, it's probably going to be more common. And boy, I just hate that. I just hate it.
Yeah, I mean there are different pricing levers that different vendors are tweaking on.
I haven't seen it very often though. Only
content model count should not be one of those levers. It shouldn't.
And then my second point is actually, and we discussed it, I think, quite a bit, is to find this balance between how beautiful that model is and how complex it is versus how long it takes for a content editor to actually use it. And so, of course, you can always try to teach content editors and marketers about these abstract things, but maybe that's not where you should put your energy. And then actually find this balance. And that's why you need, how do you call these things? Like an exploration phase. Like, how does my content fit this project that we're going to do? And how does it fit in 2 years when we have an extra channel? And then just figure it out and simplify to almost MVP content model. But that's more my approach, having had to deal with these really huge projects where it always went wrong.
No, I think that's an excellent point. And again, we talked a little bit about that in the POC phase. I think it's important to understand, one, that balance between sort of levels of abstraction and complexity, for the model itself, but also if you have a really abstract model, and you do have to have a really abstract model because of your use case, how well does the CMS support that? In order to do that task of saying, oh, okay, I'm making a reference to this thing and it doesn't exist. Does it easily pop up that modal dialogue, allowing you to do that and staying in the context of your original thing that you're making, or not? Because that one little thing from a usability perspective has massive implications. Content authors, if they're having to create some complex compound item that takes an hour, let's be honest, nobody can focus for 1 full hour. And so, they may have to abandon halfway through and pick it up. Will the system allow you to do that? Does it time out or not? Does it let you find those other associated references and still work in the content of the first thing that you're making? To Dean's point about validation, does it let you actually save that content item even though you've only completed half of it? Like, these are all very fiddly things that the only way to answer for yourself is to actually try it and throw the use case at the CMS and say, how easy is it really? And get your stakeholders, who are your content creators, to figure that out and give you that feedback, because it may influence what CMS you choose. It may influence how abstract your model it is. There's a lot of things there that you need to learn from.
I think in the end it's a team buy. Like, we see it even very close to home with the uniform. It was not the blog, but like the how-to guides that were content modeled in such a nice way, but took like 2 hours to make one guide, and we had like a lot. And so then you actually talk amongst each other and you fix it. But if you have a team buy-in on a CMS versus the code versus developers versus marketers and content editors, and you talk together, say, this is how I want to do it, that's a much easier discussion than doing it afterwards.
Content models don't live in vacuums.
Nope, clearly.
Within editor limitations, within UI limitations. And I think we're just going to come full circle with our phrase, it depends.
It depends. Okay, I'm going to just start a podcast series called It Depends and talk about.
We're going to rename this series.
Lawyers be damned. I think that's a great way to end it, actually, and I think it's a wonderful point. Dean, again, I really, really appreciate you joining us for this. I'll plug your book one more time. So we talked about this.
Put it in front of the camera. There we go.
There we go.
This
we talked about
it's got 23 different criteria, different modeling criteria, and it starts from the absolute basics. It is essentially 200 pages of what we've been talking about here. It goes deep into how CMSs model content and the different capabilities. And if you have a model-heavy situation, it's worth reading. It says, in a hypothetical world, these are all the different options that you have to pick from, and then you need to pick which ones matter to you. And I think it's always good to know what options are available. And so I wrote it all down, and you can buy it. It's not on Amazon.
Perfect. And at that, Tim, as well, thank you again for joining us, as always, as my trusty co-host. And Dean, thank you again. And thanks, everybody, for watching on Headless Creator. And please continue to join us in the future.
Cheers, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.